But just to start off, I'd like to kind of contextualize traditional African and African-based religions in Florida within the context of the Atlantic world. I think that Florida has a particularly interesting position, being located somewhat halfway in the Atlantic and halfway in the Caribbean, right? So we have this interesting peninsula that's kind of jutting out into the middle of this large body of water that makes up the Atlantic Ocean and the Caribbean. And so its physical disposition is somewhat representational of its social, economic, and historical position as well. And I think that is the main thing that makes Florida history unique within the context of the United States, and then also important when we're talking about the African diaspora and the Caribbean as well. Some interesting and important facts about Florida. Florida was home to the oldest free black settlement in the United States. It was Fort Mose, founded in about 1783 with runaway slaves and Native Americans. Fort Mose was established when Florida was still in the possession of the Spaniards, and so there was a declaration, I think, in the late 1600s, where the Spanish king declared that any English slaves that ran away would be allowed to be free in Spanish territory. And at that time, Florida was the nearest Spanish territory where slaves could run away and become free. In my research, I was interestingly unable to locate a lot about, I'd say, post-revolutionary and antebellum African traditions in Florida. There is clearly a huge gap in the literature that addresses, that doesn't address what exactly was going on with people of African descent within the context of African and African-based religions in Florida, which is particularly interesting. Nevertheless, we can surmise or we can infer that people of African descent were certainly doing what they were doing in Florida from the period of the Revolutionary War right up into the Civil War and throughout. Some important points in history include the Haitian Revolution, which took place around, I think, 1792, if I'm not mistaken. And there was a lot of migration between Haiti and Florida, as well as Louisiana and Haiti and Florida. So there is definitely a connection there. I don't know if we have any representatives of the Vodun tradition here who would be able to speak to this. Also, within the time period of the 1800s, there was a lot of migration going on between Florida and Cuba. And as we know, Florida and Cuba have a long history and a connection with the Yoruba tradition that came through Cuba that eventually made its way up into the northeast in the major cities of New York, Philadelphia, Jersey, and that whole metro area. So I think also that when we think about, United States history, we tend to get a little bit myopic when we think about what was going on in the United States in relation to what was going on in the rest of the world. And so I would like for everyone to keep in mind that as we discuss Florida, we're discussing it in relation to what was going on in this whole Atlantic world during the whole period of the slave trade. So when we think about states like South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, etc., we tend to have this view that they were functioning facing the West, correct? We think about those states in relation to the United States establishing itself as a nation, the first state, the second state, the third state, etc. But we have to keep in mind that this entire time period, much of what was going on economically, socially, and politically was actually facing the East. It was actually facing the Atlantic world. There was a lot of traveling going on between Europe and the Americas. There was a lot of traveling going on between Africa and the Americas. There was a lot of traveling going on between the Caribbean and the Americas, with Florida playing a major role in what was happening in the history of the United States at that time. So with that being said, I think that we can look to the major groups who were brought over to the United States during the slave trade. If we think about the continent of Africa, we know based on the records that we have pertaining to the slave trade, people from Africa came from as far north as of Mali all the way down to about Angola. There is a little bit of work that's been done within the last 10 years concerning the specific ethnic groups and where they were distributed, but I wasn't really able to locate exactly what was going on in Florida at the time. Most of the work that I've looked at has focused mostly on Virginia, South Carolina, and Georgia, but I can guess that since during the late 18th, the mid to late 19th century, which would be the 1800s, the last wave of slaves, the largest populations were coming from the Bight of Benin, which includes the countries of Dahomey, now contemporarily known as Benin, Nigeria, Togo, and Cameroon, that area that's right under the hump of Africa. Before that point in time, there were huge numbers of Africans coming from what we think of as the Congo Basin. So we're talking about Angola, we're talking about modern day Congo, and I think I'm missing Gabon, that area. So whatever traditions, whatever African and African-based traditions that show up here in the state of Florida